Welcome to Corporate Therapy, the podcast where we unpack the dumb shit businesses do. We ask the big juicy questions, why, what were they thinking, and then we chase down the answers so you lazy sods don't have to. I'm Matt.
And I'm Rob, and today we're diving into return to work, where we're going to touch on, does physical proximity really shape culture? Does collaboration sparkle more when we share the same air? Productivity, are we just phoning it in? What about well-being and happiness? Where do they live today? And finally, does it all depend on our circumstances?
So, Rob, this is a topic that I know is near and dear to many folks. And one of the topics that I get talked on or see talked on a lot is around proximity is what shapes culture. You need to be in the same office or in the same room for culture to spark and ignite. At least every CEO's out there spruiking, this is the reason you need to go back. What's your take on culture in the office?
I guess I understand why CEOs would see it that way. It seems to just make sense that if we were in the office, we're having a more human, more physical connection. We can read body language. We can see facial expressions, all of that sort of stuff. It makes perfect sense why they would think that. And, let's be honest, in-person interactions do fuel trust in people. That having a sense of proximity with other folks it makes perfect sense. That helps us to feel like we're part of that group. But there's a problem here. And the problem is that culture's been in the toilet since long before we were struggling with the return to office. Very few organizations that I come across are actively working on their culture. What they tend to do is go, these are the things we value. Let's hire people that also value those things. And then we'll watch it grow organically and we'll sit back and pat ourselves on the back for a job well done. But that's not often the case. Interestingly enough, and I think you did some research on this, Matt. You were looking at some work that Gallup did, where they were talking about hybrid driving the greatest level of connection.
Yeah, I think that was kind of an interesting one, because when I dived into what Gallup was saying, if you read between the lines, it looks like organizations that spent more time intentionally designing the experience of both staff, whether it be remote and in the office, saw a lift in engagement. And it's like, hold on a second, you mean giving a shit about your people and actually designing experience with them pays off? I mean, who knew? I think that's the bit that stunned me, is that like believing that you can be passive around shaping your culture and everything's going to work out versus actively designing for it has a real payback.
And that's the thing for me is that, if you expect your culture to grow passively, one of two things will happen. Either it won't grow or it will grow in ways that you didn't expect. And that can be just as terrifying. But I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's about an intentional intervention in culture, and whether that's happening in a physical environment or in a hybrid one, I think we're going to get much better results. The point that we spoke about, where with hybrid, you're having to intentionally design the times that your people are in the office or the times that they're online so that there's some sort of culture involved. That's obviously the kicker for me in this.
The bit that kind of just pause and take a step back is like, to say that culture can only happen in the office, I don't know, seems a little bit old school, a little bit weird in this space.
Sure.
Have you been in environments where you felt connected or belonging or part of a team, but you weren't in the same space?
Yeah, absolutely. And I so this is kind of weird for me. I've been living in Australia since 1999, right? So when I hear CEOs say, "Oh, you can't have any sort of proper physical relation, or any sort of proper cultural relationship with somebody that
HR
you're
will
not
be
in."
speaking. HR's going to come speak with you shortly, then, Rob.
Yeah. I'll try that again. But yeah, when CEOs say that you can't have any sort of a cultural relationship with somebody that you're not in the same physical space as, I think about, well, that's kind of weird, because I still stay in touch with my family. I do that mostly via Skype or Zoom or something like that, and we have a fine time. Now, don't get me wrong. Do we have a better time when they come to visit? Sure. But that's because we intentionally design it to have a better time. We go on trips, we visit restaurants, we go and see music, all of that sort of stuff. Whereas with Skype, or Zoom or whatever we're using, there's a little bit of banter going back and forth, but we still have a relationship. I have as much of a relationship with my sisters on my WhatsApp group than a lot of people have in their hybrid working environment.
So speaking of hybrid, though, I mean, it looks like it's pretty rough on the managers because they're still trying to figure out how do I actually make this work in this environment. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think this is actually a similar point to the one that we were just speaking about. In that, I mentioned earlier that culture was in the toilet long before hybrid working became a thing. I think managers have been struggling with leading their teams for as long as I can remember, right? Since I got involved in leadership training, since I got involved in leadership coaching. Most of the managers I know are, and this has been going on since the dawn of time, have been thrown into management gigs because they were really good at whatever technical specialty they did before. And of course, if they're really good at that technical specialty, they can manage a whole heap of people who have that technical specialty, and they'll be fine at it. That's why I became a training manager in my corporate life. Was that I was a good trainer. Not that I had any leadership skills. So I think the issue that we have here is that it's tough enough as it is that we expect managers to be able to lead people without setting them up for success.
Yeah.
But when you take that and put it into a complicated environment like hybrid as well, the stress that puts on those managers makes a huge difference.
So is the other part though that when it comes to culture is, or at least work, is
Hmm.
we're both fossils. Like we grew up in the physical office
Sure,
space, right? And that's where we made friendships. I mean, that's where we met each other was work in this
sure, yeah.
environment. And a beautiful friendship kind of grows. But is there a danger though that if you don't have that office face to face time, that you don't really have the same types of friendships or the same ability to form friendships at work?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is a real danger there. If you're 100% remote, it's difficult for you to develop a relationship with somebody who works in the same organization with you, particularly if they're 100% remote as well. If you only ever see them on the screen, it's kind of difficult for you to build a relationship with them. I like a hybrid model. I like a hybrid model because when I'm doing the stuff that requires a human connection, I can be there. And when I'm not, when I'm writing invoices or doing admin or whatever, I can be sat in front of my laptop anywhere I choose, where the stress levels are low and the distraction factors out of the way. I do genuinely think that it's trickier to build a relationship in a remote
Mm,
environment. I don't think it's too tricky to maintain a relationship. Like if
okay.
you've built one, so if you consider the friendship that we have, that we built when we were at work, when we had lots of opportunities to have face to face interactions. Since that point, for the last couple of years, I think we can count on the fingers of one hand the amount of time we've seen each other in person, right?
Yeah.
Um, but we chat online. We chat here. We chat playing online games. We, we chat over the phone, and
Yeah.
and the relationship is built. So it's actually quite easy to maintain in a scenario like this, which is why folks that I've built friendships with at work still in touch with 20 years later, despite the fact that we might see each other once or twice a year if we're lucky.
So is the lesson we're trying to encourage that comes out of culture, is it's defined less by the physical location and more about what we do? And so it's only those organizations that are going to put in the hard yards to intentionally craft the office in remote workplaces for the people who are going to be the real winners here.
Yeah.
Well, this probably brings us onto the nice next topic around collaboration, something that is hot on the heels of culture. And I think that just about every CEO say, "Wow, we collaborate much better when we're sharing the same ear." What's your take on this? Where the office really rocks, like, and the ability to be in the zone on this one, Rob?
So I think this is interesting. I think if you're involved in particularly a creative collaboration, I think face to face works well, and I think that being in the office, we have this ability to observe the people around us and really learn from them. Um, there's there's an ability to learn from reading between the lines. There's an ability to be creative in such a way that you can take what's going on and really connect with somebody to the point where you go, hey, there's something you're not saying out loud here,
Yeah.
or whatever's on your mind, because I can see it. I can see the thought behind your eyes. Just let it out so we can all have a shot at building on it, or whatever. So there's an opportunity there in a face-to-face environment that I think is tricky in a remote environment. Um, the, I think if I remember correctly, you were telling me that you looked into a bit of research from Harvard that said you had to be within 20 meters of somebody for this to have an effect. Can you tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's like, okay, so we're going to be in the zone and you kind of got your mob around you that's going through
Mm,
the very people you kind of hang out with. But Harvard, the big push has been you need to all be in the office so you can learn from each other. Well, it turns out it's only limited to about 20-meter radius from where you're sitting at this point in time,
right.
is what Harvard figured out. Beyond that, it drops off like an absolute crater in the space. So, and that kind of makes intuitive sense because you're kind of turned to the person to the left of you or the right saying, hey, what's the answer here or what's going down? And so when you start thinking about large campuses or multi-tiered buildings that you've got through multiple floors, saying you all need to be in there because you're going to learn from everyone, it's actually bullshit. You're only going
Yeah.
to learn from 20-meter radius. Now,
Mm,
that's not to say, therefore, there's no value in getting people to the office. It's just, it's much more constrained than what you think it is. And that's not surprising then when you actually go into some of these larger corporates and you go walk around the floors, you watch the staff, right?
mm,
And that they're on Zoom or Teams calls with their colleagues that are on
sure.
different floors, different areas or remote. And so saying come into the work to hang out on a Teams call just seems like an absolute plonker of a moment for people to do. I
Yeah,
think,
absolutely.
yeah, I think the bit that I'd love to hear a bit more from you, Rob, is around
Mm,
the creative energy. I mean, when COVID
mm.
hit, right, and it's like, hey, Rob, you're in the facilitation game, which is face to face, and you're now going to do it all remote. What was going through your mind?
You don't want me to say out loud what was going through my mind at that point. Um, I'll be entirely honest with you, Matt. I was terrified. I was
Mm,
absolutely terrified because, as you pointed out, I am a bit of an old fossil. My days of adapting to new technology are coming to a close. Let's put it that way. Um, so I was in a position where okay, this pandemic's hit, and you earn your living from face to face training and coaching.
mm,
What are you going to do? And I was lucky enough to be doing a piece of work with a client at the time who had a very, I guess, a very relaxed and very optimistic approach to this. And what they said was, "Hey, can you design a human centered design program for some of the students in one of the incubators that we run here, and can we do it online?" And I was like, honestly, I don't know, but let's give it a red hot go and see what happens.
yep.
So we did. Myself and our good friend Nathan Baird spent a little bit of time videoing some theory, putting together online workshops using Zoom and Miro and so on. And basically what we did was we put the theory into video so that the guys could just watch the videos, learn the theory, and we spent the interaction time in the workshops where we used Zoom and Miro to have little breakout rooms, and so they could virtual post-it note and virtual whiteboard and what have you, and it worked a charm. It worked absolutely fine, and we stay in touch with those folks to this day. um it was awesome, but would I have it over a face-to-face program? Hell no. It's much easier for us to have that kind of connection in a face-to-face space when we're trying to be creative, particularly when we're trying to collaborate to be creative. Um, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible online or in a hybrid or remote setup. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's not beneficial to do it in a hybrid or remote setup. I think there are too many old fossils like me who would just go, no, that's not the way we've always done things, and therefore that's not the way we're always going to do them going forward. But when you're forced into trying this, which I think we were
Yeah.
by the pandemic, um, you realize pretty quickly that this has legs, and now that it has legs, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I know CEOs are talking about everybody being back in the office by 2026, I think it was. Um,
Mm.
but they're going to alienate an awful lot of folks doing that.
Yeah.
That's my gut feel on it anyway.
From my perspective, like I find this topic incredibly interesting because, I've been lucky enough to win awards for online
Mm,
collaboration with Miro in the space. I play online games at night where collaboration with folks I've never even met in physical and real life, which requires real coordination. But there's something still special when you're in a room together, collaborating, ideating on a real creative space. It's so bloody hard to describe, and I've never been able to quite replicate that, no matter which online space I've tried to be. I'm worried that you've got to be very mindful around extroverts versus introverts and how do you be inclusive in that space. But you picked up on it, Rob. You get to feel the energy, and that kind of allows you to change the rhythm when
mm,
facilitating the workshop, and it allows just the building on each other's ideas to be so much more fluid and natural. And
sure.
I just see, even as a facilitator, the nervousness is what if something goes wrong with the tech? So you've always got like 20% of your energy going towards how do I play in this tech? And then even when you look at the participants, 20 to 40% of the energy is going to, okay, how do I make this tech? I don't want to embarrass myself. You don't have that in a face-to-face environment. All I got to figure out is how to use a Sharpie and a whiteboard. But again, that might be
Yeah.
challenging for some audiences. Um,
You're onto something there, Matt, because I remember when we started doing work via Zoom and Teams and Miro and all of that stuff at the start of the pandemic. One of the things that I heard a whole heap of facilitators experiencing, and I experienced myself, was fatigue. And it was fatigue after a much shorter time than you would get fatigued in a face-to-face environment. So we realized pretty quickly you can't do a full day of online training, right?
yeah. Yep.
People will, will quite literally check out of that. And as facilitators, we realized pretty quickly we didn't want to do a full day of online training anyway because we were buggered by 11:30
Yep.
when we started at 9. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was you had 25 other faces on the screen, let's say, and your body is set up, your mind is set up to try to work out what the body language of each of those people is telling you. So you were wrecked because your body's like, I'm trying to do this with 25 different people at the same time. Now the interesting thing for me is that means, as you say, there's a whole heap of your attention that's worried about, is the technology going to work? Can I read the body language of all these 25 people? Why am I so bloody tired? You're thinking about everything except how do
Yeah.
I get the best collaboration results, the best creativity results for these folks here? So, it's doable, but it's tricky, and I still think it's easier in a face to face environment and a little more effective.
But what if we flip the script and look at it from the remote perspective? I mean, where do you
Hmm.
see some of the advantages of remote playing out?
Well, that's an interesting one. You said it yourself just a moment ago that you see people in corporates all the time who are sitting in there on Teams calls with their people on their floors. I've gone in to deliver training in certain corporates, and I've been asked to do, can you do two face-to-face sessions and one hybrid session or remote session rather for the folks that are at home? And what I've noticed is there's people logging into the remote session that I saw earlier. I've worked with this organization for 5 or 6 years. I spotted them and I'm like, I know you're a floor up. And rather than come down and hang out in this little auditorium with me, you'd rather jump on Teams and turn your camera off so you can pretend like you attended and do something else instead. So there are things like that going on. But for me, the thing that I love about remote is the complete lack of distraction.
Mm.
And I know that sounds weird because surely there are a whole heap of things in your home that would distract you, and there are, yeah. Um, but when I need to be creative and collaborative, and I'm in a face-to-face environment, I can't be distracted by anything else because I've got to give 100% of my attention to the participants in that room. When I'm at home and I'm working on stuff, it's usually the boring stuff. It's usually the admin stuff, or writing an article, or putting together a new piece of training, or collating all of my notes about coaching or what have you. And at that stage, I just want to be left alone to get stuff done. I don't want phone calls or water cooler chats or to build culture. I want to put 100% of my attention on getting this spreadsheet nailed, which is much, much easier for me to do at home because, I get to make the choice. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there are some people that will struggle with that choice. I've struggled with it myself. Sometimes when you're doing an incredibly boring piece of work, the PlayStation is sitting over there just calling to you and going, go on, just have a little game. You'll be fine, Or you're like, I'll take a little break here and I'll go have a cup of tea, or I'll see how the cat's doing, or whatever. But if you've got any sort of discipline at all, it's much, much easier to shut yourself down in a focused environment than it is in a face-to-face environment, because you only have to control yourself. In an office environment, in a face-to-face environment, you've got to control all of those people sitting around you in that 20-meter radius, right? They're coming to you and asking you questions. They're telling you jokes, telling you about how their weekend went. You're doing all of the things that are building culture. But it means you get less done. So I think there's a huge um, there's a huge opportunity for us to use remote to increase productivity in people where they're concentrating on that stuff that requires a bit of discipline.
When it comes to collaboration, though, for remote, that I think gets overglassed or looked over, is the fact that a lot of organizations have just distributed staff, right? Not because of
Sure.
remote or because of COVID, but because they work out of different states or different geography that's going as part of it, and saying everybody needs to be in the same building just as feasibly or physically not even an option for them. So I think
Sure.
remote can actually be more inclusive of hearing voices. And this is particularly important if you're trying to connect headquarters with what's actually happening out in the field. I think
Mm.
that would be a key benefit for me of seeing where remote really shines. I think the bit that kind of surprised me, though, is there's not always a lot of conversation about access to global talent. Like, I mean, hold on a second. It's like,
Yeah.
you've got the ability here. If you've now pushed a lot more activity being enabled to be done remotely, what's stopping us from looking outside of our own country and being able to access talent? What's your take on that, Rob?
I think that's a real missed opportunity. There was a friend of mine that I was working with at the time who said, we could be screwed here. Once people realize that they don't need to hire us, they can hire that gun guy from over in Silicon Valley, or whatever it was, and we can work together. That was interesting. What I don't know, and I haven't got my head around this yet, is why that hasn't happened.
Hmm.
Why it is that we still prefer to go almost hyper local,
Yep.
where we can. It's not even just that I'll use somebody from Australia. It's that I'll use somebody from Brisbane, or I'll use somebody from Sydney, or
Yep.
why, when you could go and get IDEO or D School, or somebody like that. It's a thing I've seen Simon Sinek talk about from time to time. The idea of a circle of safety,
Yep.
and that as you feel more comfortable, your circle of safety expands. I think we've been going through so much change that our circle of safety has shrunk to a
Yep.
point where we've become really, really insular. So I think we want to use people that we know, people that are close, people that are the same as us, that kind of thing, rather than take advantage of what's a real opportunity here. We are seeing it in
Yep.
some places, I guess, but it's rare, where people are taking advantage of the fact that they now have access to folks that are way outside who they would have had access to previously.
I think this is backed up by the research where a study by Nature Human Behavior in 2021 actually found that the remote networks was shrinking the connections that were going through. And you were sort of sticking in that bubble that you spoke about. And
Yeah,
they
yeah,
studied sort of organizations, in particular around Microsoft and their staff, and found that, hey, they were hanging out more and more in their own team, in their own worlds, right? And so networks became super siloed. So I think this is one of the dangers of remote is you kind of stay within your lane of the people you know,
sure.
and going beyond that gets a lot bloody harder. So I would argue that therefore collaboration, there is some merit in the return to office and helping to be able to connect with people you just don't know or don't met. But again, this requires an intentional design for getting teams to hang out together. And I think this is why the hybrid model is that beautiful balance, because you're intentionally designing for moments for connection that are going in
Sure.
that space.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is the intentional design piece. We saw that with culture. I think we're seeing it again here with collaboration, and hybrid kind of forces us into doing that.
Well, this kind of brings us on to productivity. And my God, this is painful to research, because every CEO out there and his dog was talking about the number one reason you need to get back into the office was because of productivity. I mean, Elon Musk came out with a quote that was, people who are not willing to work in the office should pretend to work somewhere else. I mean, that kind of exemplified the hostility or belief between how CEOs actually viewing the staff or working remotely. My problem was, though, trying to get to the bottom of what the evidence or the data was actually saying was bloody murky
Mm.
and really hard to fathom, because I literally found studies saying you're more productive in the home, with McKinsey saying 83% of staff felt they're more productive in the space. Flip side of that, I found Stanford study saying, no, you're 10% less productive when you're working in the home.
Mm.
But both of those studies had flaws. I mean, if you look at the McKinsey's piece, you've asked staff, are you more productive in the home? I mean, which staff member's going, hey, I'm hanging out my PJs, I'm kicking back on that PlayStation, right? Like, nobody's going to admit to that. I mean, flip side of that, you look at the Stanford study, right? The reason they actually talked about it being less productive in work blew me away. It was because the amount of extra time that was having to spend on communicating and coordinating activities. And so I dug a little bit deeper into that, and I found a Microsoft study that talked about the number of meetings that we're now having since COVID kind of kicked in is up 153% in that space, right?
As if
And
it wasn't enough before.
yeah. And it's like, well, why did that kick in? And I think it comes back to those middle managers or the management of people going, I can't physically see them. And that was my cue to know if they were actually doing work. Therefore, I'm going to put in the only mechanism I know, which is a meeting, and I'm going to interrogate the living shit out of them. But that stat gets worse. I think 46% of meetings are double booked, right? So you're wondering why staff are feeling stressed that are going in that space. It's because you're literally being pulled from pillar to post with very little time to actually do the work. What's
Sure.
your take?
I think the fact you opened up with a quote from Elon Musk, that people should pretend to work elsewhere. I heard another chat with Elon Musk where somebody accused him of being a micromanager, and his response was to smile and say, "No, I'm not a micromanager. I'm worse than that. I'm a nano manager." This is the guy who slept on the floor of the Tesla factory when the Model 3s weren't coming out in time. There are a couple of things that I admire about Elon, but his leadership is not one of them. And I think this is the thing, right? Most of the folks that I've heard talking about, I need my people back at work because they're just not productive at home. When you read a little between the lines, when you dig into that, what you're finding is they're telling you that they're micromanagers. Maybe not as bad as Elon being a nano manager, but they're micromanagers. They're people who have to have control. And the reason that they have to have control is that they don't trust their people. The
Yep.
reason that they don't trust their people is they're still very much on their training wheels. They haven't nailed leadership yet, because the leaders that are coming to me and saying, "No, I'm delighted for my people to work from home," are people who aren't on their training wheels, are people who have built a culture of trust, at least within their team, if not within their organization. So I think that's vitally important. Is Sure, productivity may be a problem, and I looked through some of the research that you did. I was blown away by the amount of it to begin with. um, but I could make sense of the fact that, of course, we're losing a bit of time because it's harder to communicate with folks, that you can't just stick your head over the cubicle or walk down a flight of stairs or whatever. When you've got to set up a Teams meeting in order to connect with somebody, of course that's going to reduce your productivity somewhat. But you also look at the fact that people aren't taking too long to get to work or get home from work, when all they have to do is fall out of bed and into their little home office. And it doesn't take them long to get to lunch and and get back from it, because it's right over there. So I can see there are elements of it where you go, yes, of course that's going to increase productivity, and of course that's going to lower it. But I think overall the key issue again is this intentionality, right? If you're a leader who wants your people to be successful,
Yep.
particularly in a remote or a hybrid environment, you have to build that culture of trust, and you have to lead them. Again, you can't just expect that to happen organically. If you think leading them involves dragging them into meetings and interrogating them until they lose the will to live, well, that's not it's not. That's micromanagement at its worst, and all it tells me is that you as a leader don't trust your people. You've got to intentionally build that trust.
But if we take a look at being a leader in this
Hmm,
environment of hybrid that's going through or remote,
hmm,
it's tough being a leader on the best of days. And the moment you suddenly things go south, performance is not where it needs to be. Projects have gone off the rails. Things have gone wrong. It's
hmm,
very challenging to be able to manage in that environment with no playbook to really be able to turn to or lean on. So I have a degree of empathy, absolutely, for managers trying to juggle it in that space. But to say that, hold on, we're going to mandate to return to the office is the only way to solve it puts all the pressure back on the staff at that
hmm.
point in time,
Yeah,
saying they're the ones that make the sacrifice. And when I looked at the productivity, you touched on there, Rob, we don't look at commute time from an employer perspective. We're ignorant of that. We choose
sure,
not to look at that measure. The average employee travels about 53 minutes one way each day. And yet that's a huge amount of time back in the person's life. Flexibility ended up being the number one driver, both attraction and retention when it comes to employees, right? Because it gave the employees the ability to start to manage their day to make the most of it. And that wasn't just juggling work; it was also juggling your life in that
sure,
space. But I saw some really ugly behaviors where it's like, oh, we're really going to frustrate that the staff member went to the gym at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or the fact that they put the washing out in that space. But if you look at people physically in the offices, they have water cooler chats. Like 30% of the in office time is just dwell time where you're just hanging out and still building
sure.
like and connecting in that kind of moment from it, or pretending to work. You're
Hmm.
just in the office.
Yeah. It,
So,
it's interesting. I think there's a lot to be said about this, and it's a very very complicated topic. Like you say, I feel for leaders who are struggling in a new normal, for want of a better word, as well.
yeah,
But if you look at this from the employee's perspective and the impact that it has on their stress levels, on their happiness, it's unreal. I've seen it in my own situation. I've seen it with my darling wife Amanda, who she likes her gardening,
yeah,
and at lunchtime she'll finish up her lunch real quick, and then she'll go out and water her plants. Now, watering her plants does nothing for the organization, or so you would think, until
yeah.
she gets back to the next call, and she's happy, and she's fulfilled, and she's stress free, and she's ready to work and work hard.
But if we look at well-being and happiness, right,
Mm,
out of the research I was able to get, like they are footnotes, right? They are not the star of the show. Instead, we talk about culture, we talk about collaboration, we talk about productivity, right? Those are the three big hitters that kept coming up in the research. But well-being and happiness are kind of shoved to the side. And this, I think, is part of what's absolutely wrong with corporates today, because there's this disconnect that happy employees can't be more productive employees. What's your take around that, Rob?
I used to work for a Virgin organization, and there was a quote from Richard Branson up on the wall that said, "It just makes sense to me that if you've got happy employees, they'll make your customers happy, and those happy customers will deliver the results that your shareholders expect." Um, employee happiness has to be up there. It
Yeah,
absolutely has to be. It can't be a footnote in a conversation like this. It's got to be the big hitter. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing over the last little while is teaching people how to look at change differently, in the hopes of developing a little bit of change resilience. And what you hear is the same old stuff every time. It's people are overwhelmed, they're
yeah,
stressed to death, they're uncertain about the future. They're worried about what's going to happen in areas that they have zero control over. It wasn't just the
yeah.
pandemic that started all of this. It was all of the restructures that are going on in all of the big corporates. It was the Russia and Ukraine war, and then the Israel and Gaza war, and there's all of this stuff going on that people are just getting monstrously overwhelmed about. And what it's doing in a lot of cases is it's leading them to withdraw.
Mm.
And in that withdrawal comes a huge amount of loneliness when you don't get the opportunity to speak out loud about stuff that's affecting you. So there's change fatigue, because all of
Yep.
this change has been coming our way, and most of us at some point particularly those of us who are a little older or who've been in the game a little longer, are throwing our hands up and going, you know what, I've had enough. I'm done. You know,
Mm.
and that's leading us to dissociate somewhat, to pull back somewhat, and that just makes us lonely. It's a nasty little spiral that happens there. So there's 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 evidence, I think, and you've done the research on this, so maybe you can back me up here. There's evidence that hybrid is stressful for leaders,
Yeah.
but there's also evidence that hybrid is massively beneficial for stress levels, for loneliness, for getting us up and moving, that sort of thing. So I'd be interested in what your research says on that.
I think it's generally shaping up that hybrid is looking like the best of both worlds for everyone but the managers that's coming
Yeah,
through. I mean, if we just look at it from the perspective of stress, where LinkedIn's 2024 study had kicked in on workplace, they found that 36% of remote workers were reporting burnout versus 42% hybrid. So it was actually better at this point to be a fully remote worker than it was with hybrid. But if you're
yeah,
fully on site, it's around around 44, 45% in that mix. But what was the interesting thing was from the happiness side of things, you found that staff were more engaged. I think Gallup picked up on it, that hybrid employees were far more consistently engaged than the full-time on-site employees. I think hybrid's a pretty interesting one because it does generally appear to be the best of both worlds, right? It looks like we've got the ability for them to be able to be physically moving, having a focused time where it's either collaboration or it ends up being in home, and it's on those invoices you're talking about there, Rob. I think it's the mixed world. It's kind of in the middle around the stress levels from a staff point of view. It's less than fully in the office, but it's slightly more than what it is being in the home. It does tackle the loneliness that's coming through. I think 1 in 5 of us around the world are lonely, and we're more lonely if we're fully remote, right? So there
yeah,
is a need to have that kind of connection. I think when it comes to being productive or being happy in this space, the fact that you end up being able to be in an environment where you can collaborate with others and can focus home means that you feel like your output, the outcomes you're working to is great. And I think that's the difference between focusing on hours versus focusing on outcomes, which seems to be like a mind blowing concept for management today. So I really think that the key group we've got to focus on helping to support is that middle management, because they hate hybrid. Like 80,
yeah,
83, 84% of them are saying in a Tiny Pulse survey saying this is exhausting and emotionally draining.
yeah.
So they are actually burning out the most in
Hmm.
that space. Have you got any thoughts on what we could do to best care for the well-being of middle managers or people leaders as they're trying to juggle hybrid? Because we know hybrid is looking like the best for collaboration, for productivity, and cultural connection. What are we
Hmm.
got to do to support these leaders?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so I've always thought that leadership itself was a reasonably simple thing, right?
Yeah,
You learn to set objectives, you give people some feedback, some coaching, you manage poor performance when you have to, you motivate folks. It sounds really easy. But there's a friend of mine who talks about you can abstract anything enough that it sounds easy. Like he talks about welding is just like cursive writing, except your pen is lightning and
yeah,
your ink is liquid metal. You can make anything sound easy. I think leadership is one of the hardest things that you'll ever do, but I also think it's
yeah,
one of the most rewarding things you'll ever do. I think the issue that we've got here is that the pressures that are on these managers are
yeah,
stopping them from focusing on the thing that's most important here, which is the people that they lead. What we need to do is make it easier for them to focus on those people, the people that they lead. What we need to do is make it easier for them to see their team as the number one priority that they've got. And to me, to do that, you need to help them get a little bit self-aware about how they're dealing with change, because that's what's going on here. The whole workplace is changing right in front of your eyes. Everything you've learned before now all of a sudden feels like it doesn't fit anymore. Now I don't believe it doesn't fit. I think it just fits in different ways. Um, but I think what sorry, that's my cat. I better let him out. Give me a second.
5 minutes later. And he's back.
Apologies. um so I think that's the thing is there's so much change coming through with hybrid that that it's left leaders in a position where they've pulled back from what should be most important to them, which is the team that they're leading. I think what
Yep.
we need to do to help them is to help them to refocus on that. And one of the ways to do that is to let them become a little bit self-aware around their responses to change and
Yep.
their team's responses to change, and actively manage that. So, going back to what we said earlier about culture, and what we said about hybrid spaces, that there's this intentional design that's important.
Mm.
We need leaders to intentionally design around change as well. You can't just go, okay, well, we're all dealing with this, so let's just suck it up
Yep.
and see what happens, because it will just crash and burn. What you need to do is go, right, we're all struggling here. We're all going through a fairly extensive change. We need to get our heads around how we respond to this and how we can make it easier to respond to it in the future.
But if you talk about individuals and looking at the different circumstances that come, we've touched just now on middle management or people leaders in there.
Sure.
Are there any other lenses that you've seen that may have a different take of whether return to the office or remote or hybrid works best?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I think the problem is the one size fits all approach
Mhm.
that people are trying to take. There, if you look at somebody who's just joined an organization, it would make perfect sense to me if that person goes, no, I don't want to be remote. I want to take some time to get to know the people that I'm going
Mm.
to be working with, to get to know who's who in the zoo, to try to get to a point where a few of them owe me a few favors and I can actually get some shit done around here. If you look at the fact that there was some research out of McKinsey, if I remember correctly, that showed that mandates to return to the office hit women harder than they hit men, basically because there were working mums that were saying that they would cut hours or quit if they didn't have flexibility. There are some career types that you just don't get an opportunity to go remote with. We heard all about them during the pandemic. They were the essential workers.
Yep.
I always found it really interesting that for a while, firefighters and the pizza delivery dude fell into the same category. They were essential workers. Um, but those are there are some jobs that you can't do remotely. There are also some jobs that really lend themselves to being done remotely.
Yep.
So there's a temptation here amongst leaders, amongst organizations, to try to impose this one size fits all approach,
Yep.
when I really think the answer to it is to do what we should have been doing all along: treat people like individuals, find out what motivates them, and be flexible in the delivery of that.
I love that, Rob. And I think a great example is we both get to hang out with audiences who are in different spaces, right?
Hmm.
And if it wasn't for COVID and the shift to going remote or online, I never would have found Miro and the opportunity to get a global audience, right? For yourself, it's the fact that you love the personal connections and the ability to be in the room with people and see that. So I think being able to just say, well, you're both facilitators, therefore you should be only in the room or should only be online, I think is a bit short-sighted. What worries me, though, and this is a recent, I think it's 2023 study that came out by KPMG of 1,300 global CEOs, and 64% of them said 100% of their staff would be back in the office full-time by 2026. Like, they see this as just a waiting game that's coming.
Yeah.
So, but it gets shittier. At this point, 87% of them said they're more likely to shower promotions, raises, and cool projects on the people who physically showed up. And I was like, WTF?
Mm. Yeah. So you spoke about the impact that it had on us differently, despite the fact that we do reasonably similar work. But forget about our work for a moment. I live, up here on a nice piece of land outside of Mudgee, where I used to live in a two-bedroom apartment in Sydney. And the only
Yep.
reason that I did that was because of COVID. I was able to go, right, well, listen, I travel for work anyway,
Yep.
and now Amanda can work remotely. Why don't we just do what we've been planning to do in retirement now, and see how that goes? Now, the danger for somebody like me with the KPMG stat that you mentioned there is, if CEOs are expecting 100% of their staff to go back to the office full time, and Amanda's one of those staff,
Mm,
99% of his staff might be going back to the office full time, but it won't be her. And this is the thing: it's not 100% of your staff that are going back to the office by
yeah.
2026. you're going to lose, I would say conservatively, 40 to 50% of them who are just going to go, nah, I'm not going back to the office full time. And now you're going to have to rehire all of those folks, and you're going to make sure that there's no flexibility in the roles that you're hiring for. But we've seen, I think the stat that I heard was that 84% of people were looking for some sort of flexibility in their work, but
Yep.
only 42% of the ads that were on LinkedIn offered it.
Yeah.
So there's a mismatch between what business thinks employees want and what employees are actually asking for. And there's a mismatch, I think, between those CEOs thinking and what their employees not just want, but I think need.
So this episode, we've asked some pretty tough questions. It's all the questions that both employers and employees have been asking in the space. And where do we kind of land on this return to office debate? I mean, like most complex issues, it's complex, right? This isn't a one size answer fits all. I mean, but forcing everybody into the same mold just feels outdated. I think it's a surefire way to lose talent, trust, and the opportunity to be creative and truly not just creative in terms of the oh, that's interesting, but actually impacting the bottom line with real change because it's fueled by talent. So I reckon instead of asking what's right for the company, maybe it's time we start asking what's right for our people. After all, the future of work isn't about where you are, it's about how you show up. Thanks for tuning in. Come back every now. This is where I probably need to figure out my script for saying goodbye here, Rob. So this has been a wild episode. We've absolutely enjoyed this. Next week, we're going to be talking about speed in business and how do you get some of that good stuff without burning out your people. In the meantime, it'd mean the world to us if you could follow us. We're on Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube, you name it, we got it. Thanks very much. See you next week.